What does it mean for Jesus to be the Son of God? Does it mean that he was born from God? Does it mean that the Father in somehow or another produced him? The Son produced the Son? Or does it mean something else? We've talked about this in our study here because John's brought it up, but he brings it up again here in 4:15 of 1 John, and I think it deserves our attention again because it is not a minor issue. It's one that is rather significant, and where you come down on this has a lot to say or actually determine where you are with respect to God. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. We're working verse by verse through 1 John. We have seen in several verses prior to this the idea that God sent his Son, and that doesn't shock a lot of people because there's many people that when they read about Jesus as the Son of God, they somehow or another look at Son as being inferior. That's the way they understand it. They think in some way that God produced the Son, sent this other person who was called the Son, but not God, sent him into the world. And of course he can send him because he's bigger, he's in charge, and the Son is not. The Son is a created being or something of that nature. And this is not at all what the scriptures would indicate. Every time that we have this expression of the Father sending the Son, the Father is sending one that is an absolute equal with himself and is going not being strong-armed into this, but going willingly as something that he has agreed upon with the Father and also the Spirit, although the Spirit is not involved in these particular passages. So that brings us then to verse 15. It says, whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him and he in him. And we use this word confess. It's a word that we've had for a long time. It has a lot of baggage. I think in some of these passages, I think it's better for us to translate this word confess as agree. Whoever agrees that Jesus is the Son of God. That's what we're talking about here. So confessing or agreeing maybe is a more modern term. As I've said, there's a lot of baggage attached to the idea of confessing, and some people kind of are more superstitious about that idea, but simply saying they agree that Jesus is the Son of God. I want to go back to John chapter 5. In John chapter 5, Jesus has healed a man that had been lame for 38 years, laying at this pool in the pool of Bethesda down in Jerusalem. And in verse 15 of John 5, it says the man went away. He healed him on the Sabbath. That's a problem. People catch him carrying it on the Sabbath and they go, who healed you? Well, they didn't know who this Jesus was. But later on, Jesus comes back to him. And the man seems to be ungrateful. He's grateful that he's healed, but he's also ungrateful, which should remind us that just because there were people that were healed and benefited from Jesus and maybe were grateful for the physical benefit they derived, didn't necessarily mean that they came to believe in Jesus all the time. So in John chapter 5, verse 15, the man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason, then the Jews were persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But he replied to them, my Father is working right up until now, and I myself am working. In other words, my Father works on the Sabbath. He doesn't sit back and put his feet up and twiddle his thumbs. He doesn't take a nap on Sabbath afternoon or something like that. And he says, so therefore I'm doing. But notice he says, my Father. For this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. On top of just persecuting him, now they want to kill him because he not only was breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling God his own Father. And this word own is the Greek pronoun idios, meaning he's my Father, unique to me in a way that he's not yours. Israel, to some degree, did look at God as their Father. He looked at them as a nation that he'd raised up. He would refer to them as his son, but not his son in the sense that God the Son was his son. Because now he says, made him his uniquely own Father, and here the end of it now, notice what the Jews say, making himself equal things with God. He's equal with God. The Son isn't a lackey. He's not a created being. He's equal with God the Father. And Jesus doesn't deny it. In fact, Jesus, as he's going to talk about that in the following verses, is going to say, well, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can't do anything from himself unless he sees the Father doing it. In other words, down here in his earthly life, during this earthly ministry, as a man, when he acted, he only did what he saw the Father doing. But that was something that, again, that we look like he's trying to back off, going, oh, no, it's only what I saw the Father do. That itself was another indication I've seen the Father. I've been with the Father. So I knew exactly what the Father wanted me to be doing down here. But remember, this is also a reference to what he's doing in his human nature. He submitted to the human, in his human nature, he submitted to the will of the Father again and again and again. It's a big theme in the Gospel of John. And he does these things. So he's making himself equal things with God. And as he goes through the following context, he never once denies it. He just is arguing for the fact that, yeah, you guys are right, I am equal with God. But think about these other things. I'm only doing what I saw the Father do. So why is that a problem that I would heal on the Sabbath? And the Father's given me authority to raise the dead and give life and all this other stuff that just keeps hammering home the fact that he is indeed God. Not a God, not a God from a God, but God equal with the Father. They're one God along with the Holy Spirit. In John chapter 10 and verse 31, let's go back up to verse 30. I and the Father are one. The Jews picked up stones again to stone him, and Jesus answered them, I showed you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you stoning me? And the Jews replied, we are not stoning you for a good work. We do not. But for blasphemy, because you being a man, make yourself out to be God. And see, they're monotheists, so they realize he's claiming to be God equal with the Father. And if we go on down to in the passage down here to verse 36, do you say of him whom the Father has sanctified? In other words, I come down here in this and I'm set apart, doing exactly what the Father wants, and sent into the world again on this mission, that I am blaspheming, or you are blaspheming because I said I am the Son of God? If I don't do the works of my Father, then don't believe me. In other words, I'm doing the works to demonstrate I'm exactly who I claim to be, God, the Son of God. See, we don't get that, because when we think of Son of God in our culture, we think of our Son. There's my Father, and then there's me. And even though I am almost 60 years old, I still do not see myself. It's hard for me to view myself as an equal with my Father. I look at him, I look at the things he's done, and it's hard for me to view myself as his equal. I'm always in some way, even if I'm coming close by accomplishing a lot of different things, if that were the case, that we would say we're closer to this level of equality. And my Father has been really good about treating me that way over the years. But it's still hard to look at it that way. And that's the way we look at it in the world. I'm not my Father. I came from my Father. But that is not at all the way the Jews understood this expression, Son of God. They understood it to be a claim to be God, claim to be equal. We go on over to John chapter 19. And this is Jesus before Pilate. And in verse 7, it says, the Jews, again, they replied to him, to Pilate, we have a law. Because Pilate says, I can't find anything wrong with him. You guys have accused him of a capital crime, namely that claiming to be king. And that would have been a capital crime because it would have been a challenge to Caesar. But he says, I can't find him to be guilty of being a king in any way a threat to Caesar. The Jews replied to him, we have a law, and by that law he ought to die. So now they're going back in desperation back to their law because he made himself out to be the Son of God. See, they're denying that he is the Son of God. They just think he's just a man. But he said they recognize he is claiming to be the Son of God. And, of course, they're indicating he's not. We don't believe in reality that he is the Son of God. If we go over to 1 John chapter 2, and we remind ourselves of the Antichrist, it says, who is a liar but the one who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and the Son. Whoever denies the Son does not have the Father. The one who confesses the Son or agrees about the Son has the Father also. Again, he's going back to saying, what are these antichrists? They're people that deny Jesus is the Christ. That had to do with his resurrection. But the second thing that was being denied, they were denying the Father and Son by denying the Son. What are they denying about him? They're denying that he's the Son. They're denying that he's God. So they had two problems. One of them, they're denying the resurrection. Second of all, they're denying his deity. And if you deny his deity, you have to deny the deity of the Father, which we don't get, because we're going, well, the Father can be God and the Son not be God. No, because the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Spirit are one God. You take one person out of the mix, it stops being, the Trinity stops being what it's supposed to be. You can't deny one of the persons without, in reality, denying all of them. And that's, again, maybe a little something for us to wrap our head around, but we've already touched on this. But again, this is going back to this whole issue that these people understood what it meant for Jesus to claim to be the Son of God. And if we go back to 1 John chapter 4 and verse 15, it says, whoever agrees that Jesus is the Son of God, they're agreeing that he is indeed deity. There's something else that John's wanted them to agree to, and that is that he really has come in flesh, meaning he's even resurrected now. So whoever agrees that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him, and he in God. In other words, this is a believer. This is a believer believing that Jesus is in reality God. Really believing that he truly is genuinely God. Not temporarily God, not a lesser God, God, because there is only one God. There's not multitudes of gods. There is one single God, period. It's not a God among gods. Our God is not a God among gods. He is the one and only God. There are beings under him that he created that the scriptures indicate they're identified at times as gods by the Hebrew term Elohim, which simply meant strong ones. And it's applied to spirit beings, it's applied to created beings, but it's also applied to God because God indeed is the ultimate strong one. All of this simply to come back to the fact, if these people really agreed with regard to the deity of Jesus Christ, in the context, they would be those believing that he indeed was raised from the dead. He had come into the world, become man, and he's writing to these believers, encouraging them. Man, you remember what you believed? Yeah, you guys remember what you believed. John even told them that back in chapter 2. You don't need me to tell you this about Jesus Christ. You don't need me to tell you these things. You already know these things. He's just reminding them. And he's doing this to try to help them to help them realize if this is true about who he is, then what does that say for these other people? But if it's true for those of you that agree, what does it mean for you? It means that God's in you. God abides in you, and you abide in him. When you agree with regard to who Jesus is the Son. And this isn't something that just happens once in a while. This is something that's true of us. Believers, we may struggle at times. We may have times that we're wondering about certain things. But if we've really come to believe in Jesus Christ, there's something that remains true, and that is we're going to stand and agree with regard to who he is. I've watched believers that have struggled tremendously with their faith, but they're always struggling with other issues in their faith. When it comes down to who Jesus Christ is, I've watched these believers not struggle with who he is and what he did. They just struggle with other matters. All this comes back again. Who is Christ? Who is Jesus? He's the Son of God, which means he is God, which means that when he came down here and became a man, he was the only one fit to provide you and I salvation by, as a man, going to a cross willingly and allowing them to put him to death and being innocent, then bearing the sins of us, the guilty, being buried and then rising again, and offering us salvation simply by believing in him. What an absolutely gracious provision of God. And then to know that God abides in us and that we are in him because we've agreed with regard to who Jesus is. Remember that. Keep that in there. Think about this with regard to who your Savior is. And with all of that, have a great day in the Lord. And thank you for joining me.